Is it just me, or are these sets pretty dynamic? This is like a great conference, right? Is everybody enjoying the conference? It's pretty amazing. Nice to see you again. Michael Wood, Field CTO here at HashiCorp. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about a super light topic to kick off the day, dealing with the SEC. Hopefully everybody's super jacked about that. How many of you work with lawyers on a regular basis? I don't know. Okay, a few of you? Yeah, excellent. So in the cyber material space, there's a lot of movement right now in terms of accountability, especially for the C-suite, in terms of how we deal with cyber risk, and especially how we report on it. And so what I would like to do is talk about this through kind of a joking but not joking kind of way, on like, what if we really cared about, really establishing good context on our cyber risk and doing a better job of like really cutting it off at the pass. So we'll kind of dig into that a little bit. To give you a little bit of a sense of how I like to talk about it, I normally start with, for those of you who've seen me present before, I use this analogy quite a bit, but there's a little bit of an industrialization that has to take place if we're going to truly control our environments. Back in 1939, give or take, this was the Willow Run facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan, where they were building B-24 Liberator aircraft. And the President of the United States had said, we need to have 50,000 of these, and we need to be able to generate 50,000 more every single year. And at the time, they could only produce 300 off this floor. And part of the reason that they could only produce 300 is because everybody was handcrafting everything. So people were literally, engineers would gather around this flying experience, if you will, and they would build it by hand. They'd craft rivets. They would stamp them into the aluminum sheeting. They built them by hand. How do you maintenance that fleet in the field? Everybody better know everything about everything if I'm going to maintenance that in the field, because everything's a custom one-off, right? So I can't maintenance the fleet. I can't control it. I don't know what the quality is. My compliance audits are just based on, do we think this thing can fly or not? Because there's not really a consistent standard. There's no machining, element to it. So they basically partnered with Ford. Edsel Ford had a chief of staff named Charles Sorensen who reviewed this, and basically it's a famous quote that he said, there's no sequence or orderly flow of materials, there's no sense of forward motion, everybody just gathers around the thing and custom builds it. Okay, difficult to audit custom builds when everything's a custom build, right? So as we start thinking about what the cloud has allowed us to do, is the cloud has allowed us to think in terms of these machined arms. Interesting thing about the cloud is a series of APIs. I can fire instructions at it, it produces something, right? Yeah? Well, so if I have all these mechanical arms, do I want people on joysticks guiding the mechanical arms? To me, that's the equivalent of ClickOps, right? ClickOps is I'm going to grab that arm and I'm going to make it staple the next couple of things, and I'm going to hope that it's consistent. The person who's doing the stapling is doing it exactly like they should every single time. Well, that's very difficult for me to go ahead and establish standards, right? Now what I have to do is I have to have a physical audit. Somebody's going to have to go behind that person. We used to do things like, bring in a tool that kind of looked over the shoulder and watched to make sure, no, you're not allowed to do that with this thing, or we'd slap your wrist, or we'd wait till you were in production, then we'd say, hey, you messed it up, you got to go back and re-rivet that baseline, networking, you left too much load balancer out there, we need to right size it. We kind of do it in retroactive fashion. But the whole point of industrialization is that we get in the flow, in the material flow, so that we address it as it's being built rather than after it's been built. How many of you know it's much easier to assert quality during design and production phase than it is post-production? If I have to recall a fleet of Pintos because they happen to explode, that's a problem, right? That's a little bit harder for me to deal with that from a quality and audit standpoint. So let's think in terms of proactive, automated approaches in our cloud automation. So let's imagine a scenario. Let's all get into your thinking caps, and we're going to get into an imaginary space. And we're going to dream of a time when companies have challenges, right? Imagine a world, a dystopian future, where travel gets shut down because system failures happen and nobody knows what to do, and it's like a zombie apocalypse. Everybody's stuck in airports all around the globe. Can you picture it? Are you with me in this so far? Okay. No, nobody can see that. All right, well, if you're following along, the systems have a big impact on our lives, right? And so government regulators look at stuff like this and they say, I better put the clamps on this industry because it kills productive, like citizens are left stranded. I've got to do something. And then now we have a regulatory change. Somebody says, now you've got to be audited against this. When we talk about things like the CrowdStrike Microsoft issue, we start looking at things like, you hear things like concentration risk becomes a big discussion point. How concentrated are you in your dependence on a single technology, where if that technology fails you, the whole house of cards comes down. Well, I need to find a way to deal with heterogeneity. I need to find a way to automate and have the ability to flex and move. And if I can't prove that to an auditor, then I just have to report, this is where the reporting stuff comes out, that I have a high systemic risk on these particular vendors, right? If I don't list that, I could get in trouble with the SEC. Make sense? So what this has led to is, because we see these things, now we have these reporting requirements, right? The SEC did its final disclosure in December, basically saying that you have 4 days once you hit a cyber incident, or when you become aware of a cyber incident, you have 4 days to report. Or you face penalties, yeah? Anybody familiar with this? Heard some of this stuff? Okay. Well, as we kind of get into this, I start asking questions about, I've read a number of the 8Ks. The 8K is the filing that you have to do. On average, according to the SEC, that's an 8.5-hour process to fill out an 8K. And what we're finding is a lot of companies, the way this is working actually in the field, is a lot of companies are kind of like, you ever see those movies where the defense attorney is asking for disclosures, and then the state comes in and says, and they just pile paperwork on top of you, and they just roll in boxes and boxes, and they say, we'll just bury you in disclosure. That's what a lot of companies are doing. We just report everything we can possibly think we can report. We'll call it immaterial, which is like it's not going to impact the business, but it's a problem. We recognize that we're going to report it. Our consumers are never going to see that. Only very, very savvy investors who are really looking at the fundamentals of a company would ever even know the 8K was filed, right? So it's like, let's just bury them in discovery. That's kind of what's happening with 8Ks. The interesting thing about cyber materiality is that it has shifted a little bit, in that because of the SolarWinds challenge, I'll be generous and call it a challenge, the CISO is under threat, right? Not just corporately, but personal liability, criminal and civil suits. Basically what happened here is, after the SolarWinds thing happened, through the investigation, we found out that the CISO was saying, hey, we have no control. I can't respond to these cyber events. We know that our back end is frail. We know it could all go down. This is a big house of cards. So it looked like the CISO was very well aware of significant cyber risk to their chain. But that was never disclosed to the public. If you were a stock trader, so the SEC really doesn't care if you're secure. You understand? Like all they care about is that you're honest with an investor. So what they're saying is, if you're going to break, tell investors you're going to break and let them properly invest their dollar. That's basically what the disclosure statement's about, right? So what I started asking myself is, what if we were honest in how we wrote our 10Ks or 8Ks? So if I was telling the street about my risk, what if I said, our software system is kind of inaccurate. My CMDB is, 50% in the neighborhood of what we're actually running. I've got 25 plus security tools. They're scattered around the enterprise. I don't know how far each of them goes. I know a handful of things that they're doing, but like what the complete estate, are we covering everything? Are we following best practices in every scenario? I don't know, it's a guess, I guess. I think we're okay. We're scanning our systems constantly, looking for breaches, but I'm pretty sure 15 to 25% of my estate I'm unaware of, and those scans aren't touching it. So there's kind of like dark zones in my scan. I think that's probably reality, right? So if I was being honest, now the way that a lawyer would go ahead and write this is say, we have a program to consistently scan our environment for vulnerabilities, and we have secrets management programs to deal with identity. I would write it in a very friendly way that sounds like we got all this stuff covered, yeah? But in reality, in the back end, this is probably more true than what I just said. It takes a long time for us to fix security issues, leaving us vulnerable to attacks. On average, it's taking us 270 days to patch systems. It was funny, I was tempted not to make this joke, but I'll go ahead and make it. If Microsoft has difficulty patching Microsoft systems, do you think Microsoft can be hard to patch for you? Maybe so, right? So if I'm talking about these vulnerabilities, yeah, there's legitimate reasons for why it's so difficult for us to go out and patch systems. But what we're looking at is, how do I make that easier? Is there a way I can make it easier? Is there a process? Like, what do we do? How do we get honest about what we're doing here? We rate our cyber risks high, medium, low, but we know this is just kind of an opinion. I was talking to a customer yesterday, and they were doing their scans, and it came back saying, we have this PKI, an expired PKI sitting out on this file system. And they called it extreme critical, like it hit the top of the charts. And then when we looked at it, when the CISO looked at it, they said it's immaterial, doesn't matter at all. Like there's no network access to that thing, nobody could actually hit it, it's expired anyway. Should it be retired and gone? Yeah, it should be, but like in my audit finding, I get all this kind of confusion about what's high risk, what's low risk. I get some wild reports coming back. And a lot of it has to do with opinion. And we have funds to do new things with security, but we can't get them approved, so we got to cut spending. We got to strengthen what we do or reduce the number of tools that we're using and bring them more into compliance. Like these are all things that we're dealing with on a pretty consistent basis. So we know we're not great. So let's say, don't raise your hand, but I feel like this is fairly a little bit accurate. I feel this kind of represents what we're doing from an industry. We're doing our best. There's a lot of things that we struggle with, and we're trying to figure out how to get comprehensive about anything that we do. If we bring in Wiz, does Wiz immediately solve all my security challenges? No. It's probably going to show me a lot of things I got to work on, right? But from there, it's often manual, or it's tasking out teams, or it's backlog items in people's, like in a developer backlog or whatever. But I'm going to go out and begin mitigating what I see out there. So this is a survey that came in from Zscaler that was looking at what are the key things that lead to breachable opportunities or security failings. And Zscaler does a pretty good job of some of these reports. For the 15th, I think it's 16, 17 years in a row, number one on the list is vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. So if I were going to go through here and say, let me figure out where I start at mitigating risk and understanding what's out there. And when we talk to LPL Financial a little bit later, you'll hear them talk about it's important for me to establish an inventory before I can even start addressing risk. I got to have an inventory. What do we have out there? What's its risk disposition? Who manages it? Like, if I don't know any of that stuff, how do I even begin to think about defending it? So let's say we're going to focus there first and say, how do we establish in our make pretend, make believe organization, we say we're going to prescribe a progressive maturity walk into better and better cyber defense. And this is going to give us really tight context so that when I do have to report to the SEC, I actually have a little bit of a sense of how we're going to mitigate the problem. Yeah, we found a problem. Yeah, it's breachable. But hey, I made a correction in this workflow, and that thing will never happen again. That'd be a great way to report to the SEC and defend yourself. But you have to have an ability to conceive of it that way, right? To provide that context. So let's start there. My team has been playing around with a couple of models that we're working through that we're calling vulnerability and patch management, or VPM. And essentially, I need to establish that set of inventory controls, not only at the system of record for my infrastructure, but also things like images and Windows. We saw in the CrowdStrike example, it's fairly important that you patch Windows and things like that. So as we get into it, let's just focus there and say that's phase one of our progressive strategy. And as we begin to work our way through, we say, okay, well, why would I focus on this? What's the business justification? How do I need to tackle that? Well, on average, it's 4.5 million. So a lot of the risk things are what-if scenarios. Like we know how the SEC plans to fine and generally speaking, what those look like. But obviously, a breach can cost you a whole lot more than just a fine. But 4.5 million per incident, and times how many incidents that this thing caused you, that can add up pretty quickly. And what we see is a lot of container images contain a lot of critical vulnerabilities. Anybody love your CVE burn down spreadsheets? Have a lot of fun with that? I feel like I need Armand's empty developer room to show all the people who love that part of it. That was a great piece of his content. But a lot of so even when we say something like 60% of data breaches involved unpatched vulnerabilities, it's actually kind of much higher. Those are 60% of the vulnerabilities that were direct contributors to the initiation of a breach, right? But it turns out that if you look at all breaches, whether it was through a social engineering, somebody stole a credential or whatever, they all had unpatched. So there's 90 some odd % of all breaches included, known vulnerabilities that were running in production. But, the ones that were like kind of effective or leveraged against them were something like 60%. So very, very high. So what we start to do is we start to try to break this down by, okay, what if we found a way to stop misconfiguration and unpatched systems? Anybody feel like HashiCorp might have an opinion on how we deal with, yes, we have an opinion. And as we get into this opinion, what we're trying to think through, and I mentioned this yesterday, but in case you weren't here yesterday, anybody heard the adage that, if I were to ask this room, who's responsible for security? The answer is everybody. All peoples everywhere, all the time, right? And then there's an ancillary argument here that says if everyone owns something, nobody does, right? So what I have to do is be very clear about the shared service model when I'm talking about cloud operating. Jay made this great point with Oxy yesterday where he was saying if we hadn't established a cloud operating model, we would not have been as successful as we were. Well, what's a cloud operating model? It's a division of duties. This is the part of security that you really need to be aware of, not the whole thing. As a developer, if I've got you in a WAF, anybody feel like that's dangerous? Maybe? How creative do you want developers to be in your firewalls? Maybe zero? Maybe zero. I'm going to venture a guess and say maybe zero. So the point is they're not responsible for the security of bot detection and prevention and DDoS and so on. That should be something, that's a gate, that's a security process that should be applied. So now we know that there's a line. Now the reason I have this article up here is because I found it fascinating. This is a little bit older, but it was a really interesting article that was talking about the demand on developers, basically to know everything about everything. And what they said is, hey, DevOps isn't enough. It needs to be DevSecOps. And but DevSecOps really isn't enough either. You need to be DevSec Risk Ops, DevSec Risk Compliance Ops. You need to be DevSec Risk Compliance Fin Ops. You need to be aware of the financial impact of what you're doing. Fin, like Biz Ops. Because the thing that you just delivered could be cannibalizing a line of revenue from another line of revenue. So are you aware of the impact you're having on the business? How many of you find that realistic? How many of you want that job? If you do, you should probably be a CEO and you should be like building a business because you understand everything about everything. Like you're some kind of massive unicorn. The point is we can't really expect this of every member of our developer or operating society. Like not everybody can have that skill. So we have to work out what that cloud operating model looks like so we appropriate, we put the right skills in the right buckets so they can execute. And I can have a good, clean sense of ownership. This is where we talk about like supply chain security and all that kind of stuff is who did this get handed to? How did we extend trust to them? And under, what was the job that they needed to provide? I think of handoffs between organizations through the API lens, which is like, I hand you this, you hand me that under these conditions where we trust each other, et cetera. And that's how handoffs should work across various operating groups. But what I'm saying here is we need to offload a lot of this risk management from developers' brain pans. Can I get this out of their brain pan? Can I let them just operate without thinking about how often they have to patch their images or how often they need to deal with infrastructure or whatever? So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that we patch systems a bunch of different ways. For Windows, we do one thing. For VMware, we do something else. We've got something else in the Red Hat world. We've got something else in the cloud. We've got something else. And typically, we have all these various moats and approaches to the way that we handle patch management. One of the other challenges is that patch management is typically kind of a mutable function where I'm changing running servers, like in real time. And that's often fraught with risk. So we have kind of like patch Wednesdays, or we have something like that where we just kind of lock everything down. We run through our patches and we cross our fingers that we don't break anything and have to roll back. It's an effort. Right? It tends to be an effort. It tends to be a lift. So what I'd like to consider, and I know this is the business track, so I'm not going to this is more of like a workflow view, But what my team has been working on is this thing that we're calling, I think Susan had mentioned it as a 30-day try to buy. And the idea is that we have pre-wired what we think is a bit of a best practice flow for the way that a change gets committed, how the image is manufactured and audited and secured and scanned and so on, and then how Terraform essentially subscribes to that good image based on the environment that is pressing out. Was everybody here for Armand's talk yesterday for the infrastructure piece? So you remember how he showed Packer going down the different channels and then Terraform picking up the production channel and punching it out? That's basically what we did. We just happened to put it in a way that we can kind of vend that environment in like our own HCP product and allow you to play with it for 30 days so you can get a sense of like, where do these images go? How do the scans run? Where do I add additional policy? You want to check those things out. But the idea is that this, let me see if the pointer works. There you go. So the engineer is going to suggest some kind of change. It's going to go into a Git repo, which is going to trigger some form of a build. That build, it may go directly to Terraform, and Terraform invokes a Packer image. But this may be an image management person who is actually updating, uploaded the latest Microsoft patches to a binary repo. And then Packer gets triggered off of that saying, hey, I've got a new binary. Let me rebuild that image according to the new binary. So I could be operating here if I'm image management. I could be operating here if I'm infrastructure, application developer, et cetera. Make sense so far? And then what I want to do is validate this, scan everything. I want to make sure it adheres to policy code. I want to make sure I'm assessing for vulnerability. This could be something like, actually LPL, we'll talk about this a little bit later, about vulnerability scanning being done by Prisma. I'm going to hook into that. I want to let security teams understand what vulnerability just came in. They were doing things in a very non-blocking way. But in this case, and you'll hear about this a little bit later, the social pressure of knowing that my vulnerabilities are being reported out to somebody else in an automated way every time I deploy is typically enough pressure that they'll say, hey, let me remediate that rather than letting it, go ahead and sit out there. Yeah, make sense? So what I want to do is tie these together in a pretty comprehensive way. Let me go back real quick. So that this produces a consistent flow of image delivery. I'm trapping all of the config mistakes using Sentinel policy or Prisma or something similar. And I'm also doing something very similar when I'm talking about image manufacturing process. I'm scanning it. I'm making sure the quality meets all of our expectations. It's within risk tolerance. There's no leaked credential in the code. Not only the code in the image itself, but also like my HCL. Is the HCL doing the right things? How secure is the HCL code? Is there anything in that? I want to scan all of it. Basically, what I want to do is I want to set up a system where I don't technically trust any of these things. I don't trust Packer. I don't trust HCP. I'm going to trust but verify. Before I authorize anything, I'm going to make sure it's all correct. In this way, I want to kill all of my misconfigs, et cetera. And then because I'm doing this in this automated fashion, and I'm dropping out these new images, then maybe I can establish like a 30-day repave. We do this internally, by the way, for HCP. When we build new, as we rev HCP behind the scenes, and you don't feel a disruption in HCP, but we're revving it all the time, and everything we have out there is on a 30-day clock for a repave. And that gives us a chance to do a lot of things. It gives us a chance to reassess the image, to replace the image in real time and continuously do it. So now I don't have a patch window. I just am constantly rolling that environment. All right? Now, if I do that right, awesome. It turns out I didn't just solve the misconfiguration and vulnerabilities problem while eliminating a patch window. I also happen to be dealing with ransomware and other malware conditions. Right? So if malware is kind of building up, or somebody does a phase 1 attack on a system and they get some software out there, if you're familiar with the SolarWinds breach, I think it had, a 14-day sleep on it, so it could get through a quarantine. And federal systems, a lot of federal systems have like a 14-day quarantine period where they put it in like a staging environment, run it near production, and make sure they don't see any kind of nefarious action on it before they promote it into production. SolarWinds actually sat there dormant for a while. Doesn't light up, doesn't look for a DNS, doesn't look for external internet, it just kind of waits. The malware just sat there. Well, if I'm turning over my estate, in less than 30 days, we'll say, or I make it to where I'm repaving this on a regular basis, maybe SolarWinds never wakes up. I'm constantly replacing with a new image, reset the clock, give it a new credential. Maybe I take the opportunity when I kick it back out there to assign it a new PKI, and now I'm rolling my PKI every 30 days. Something like that. Now I'm getting really, really clean on how I kind of replace all this stuff. But I happen to be replacing it with a known good image, which is going to destroy or remove or defend against kind of that ransomware by keeping everything very ephemeral. So let's consider unauthorized access, insider threat, phishing, social engineering. How do we start having our people become a little bit of a challenge for us? And I'm going to move through the rest of this pretty quickly because I think you get the idea of we're going to continue to add decorations to this workflow. Now I've got a workflow for the delivery of infrastructure. Now all I'm doing is I'm bringing in the SLM product portfolio and beginning to tie that in where I assign trust. When I trust your infrastructure, I'll issue it a credential. I'll issue it some trust. So we're going to bring in identity, and we're going to start doing a little bit more observability at this point. And we could be doing observability all the way through, but I'm just giving you an idea of kind of the progression. And then, so what I'm dealing with here is social engineering and phishing has to do with the fact that developers have too much privilege. We carry too much privilege. 90 plus, 98% plus of cloud operators carry too high a permission. How many of you have developers with more than 5 secrets at their fingertips? If there's somebody who's not raising their hand, I really want to talk to you afterwards. I was talking to one insurance company who said they just made a wild guess, and they said we think they have 200 secrets. Between Git, multiple snowflakes, like all of the various things that they have access to. There's a ton of stuff out there, and all of those secrets have to be maintained. We got to roll them. We have to make them roll them. We have to get we got to get a protection package for all of the credentials that they have and permissions. So how do we, that obviously is a social engineering threat, yeah? If I can phish one of those folks with 200 keys on their key ring, then I'm in, right? I get some pretty wide opportunity within your enterprise. So what I want to do is begin thinking about how do I remove, I don't want this operator, whoever that is, engineer, developer, whoever that is, I don't want them to have any secrets, preferably. What I'd like is a passwordless approach, Entra, passwordless, Okta, whatever you want to do there. Maybe some biometric and an environmental attestation that kind of gives me an object, a security object that I can kind of flex on. And then when they submit that they want to do something, they submit it, the same flow goes. All I've done here is I've decorated it with dynamic credentialing systems, which say, hey, I have an authorized request to build an image. Can I build an image? Vault, I need a credential. Vault provides the credential. We do the thing. The credential gets flushed out. Maybe that image requires a PKI. Vault, can I have a PKI? Is there an auth policy which grants that? And I can automate the delivery of all of those things. Now I don't have developers going to a UI or a ticketing system saying, hey, I need a new database credential. 26 days later, after the EA review and the database team has argued with you about your level of privileges, and after the, you know what I mean? Like after you go through all the debate, you finally get the credential, and then you say, in fact, make that a 25-year credential and lose my number, because this is awful. Okay, so that's typically how we do it. The more I can get this more automated, where we're injecting these things into the process, they don't care what the process is. They don't care how often you rotate those secrets. They don't care how you drive an audit, because it's being provided in such a seamless way, they just get their job done. So we decorate it one more layer, okay? So now we've kind of dealt with that, and I'm going to go very quickly through the rest because I really don't have any time to dig in much further than this. But as we build through this, we're going to get even more detailed around now that I have this dynamic secrets engine issuing credentials to machines, let's just extend that to human beings. Let's have Terraform drop out something like a Kubernetes cluster and then tell Boundary, hey, there's a new target. Somebody might need to administer this. And now I have a privileged connection system, which again reveals no secrets, where they come in, they hit Boundary, they see that they've got a new target, which is that new Kubernetes system, they click it, and behind the scenes we do a just-in-time credentialing and we grant them, secure access to that privileged system. So once I can do that, now I'm tying that off, and I'm not even giving them secrets for things where they log in and do SSH operations, et cetera. Then we kind of extend that. And as we talk through this, obviously observability can be much earlier in the process because as we're dealing with images, I want to build that observability into my images. I want to build that observability into my infrastructure from the get-go. But now that I have this centralized record keeping, I also want to get really good at what I do with all those logs, right? How do I understand who did what, when, where, and how? We're talking compliance, right? What are they going to ask you in an audit? Like who could have touched this? You know, did you report this possible breach? Are you following your own SOPs? Was there a compensating transaction? You're going to have all these questions. With proper observability, I can tell you more and more and more what's happening within my environment. Who could have touched it? Under what conditions? And then we can keep walking through this and start talking about FinOps as well. I love the conversation around FinOps mainly because when we talk about something like a material, yeah, there you go. When we're talking about how material is a breach, how do we determine materiality? According to the SEC, if a reasonable stockholder would care, it's material. Sounds vague. Can anybody tell me what an individual stock person thinks about your cyber? So I read I read a telco's 8K, and it was like we lost customer data for this section of stuff, but it was immaterial, and it took them like 6 months to report it, and they got special dispensation for the SEC to like violate everything about the 8K. Now, immaterial. Let's define immaterial. The reason they called it immaterial is because there wasn't a financial impact. Subscriptions didn't fall. We didn't lose subscribers. In fact, we're just kind of keeping it on the low. And I'm out of time, so sorry about this, Sarah. I'm going a little long. Where we go from here is I want to make sure that we're measuring these things as we go. If I pull back and show a wide shot, I'll leave this for you to kind of look through so that you can understand how we think of this from a wide shot perspective. Where do these various compliance pieces play? I want to abstract away my users with Waypoint. Their intentions are what's getting submitted. They're being vetted for policy. Dynamic secrets are being assigned, and then we're getting out into the production where we've got monitoring and observability for service health, welfare, well-being, et cetera. And now I'm getting a little bit better about how I handle my cyber controls broadly. I need to be able to, this requires a team. The team needs to be able to operate cleanly with other teams that fall outside of the platform team. So be aware of these trade-offs and how do I interact. Most of the teams that do this very, very well have worked out some kind of an exchange program where they bring somebody in from security to run on the infrastructure team as an example, and they put an infrastructure person over on the security team, and they both kind of learn from each other and build those tight bonds so that we're in lockstep with the way that we drive out our programs in this manner. I often talk about NPS is an interesting thing. When I see this pattern, oftentimes what I'm looking for when I'm looking at NPS is this is probably when I introduced a change. How many of you know developers aren't too keen on change? Operators probably aren't either. In fact, you're probably not good on change. I mean, let's not go into introspection today, but point is, we don't like a lot of change, but when we introduce a new change, what we see is we see a dip in NPS score because of the change. And then what we normally see is once the value of that change is realized, we see this uptick again, and then we return to the mean. We return back to what our NPS score generally hovers around. That means adoption. That means they've accepted the change. Does that make sense? So sometimes I can use NPS to gauge where we are in the hype curve of where we made the change, and I want to use that as one of my measures. The FinOps piece, I'll leave this for another time, but I want to make sure that I'm not over-investing on my infrastructure to the point that I'm sacrificing all of my margin. The only way to get there is to understand FinOps on both sides. And then finally, we're holding this careful tension between MTTD and MTTR. So I don't want to over-index on getting there fast and then realizing that I built 100,000 vulnerabilities and my MTTR just goes up. I just crushed my MTTR. I can't resolve anything. So I need to keep those in healthy tension, which is what we're trying to do with these automated processes. And so that allows us to kind of centralize all this record keeping. Now imagine a future state where I have all this inventory. I have the ability to reason over it. I can ask it questions. Is this all within policy, et cetera? There's a bright, bright future if we get this automation step right. And with that, let me go ahead and stop there. There's a lot going on that I think is really, really fascinating. As you hear all of these announcements, understand we're marching towards this view of bringing this together, solving these really systemic problems, and hopefully delivering a brighter future for the way that we deal with patching, vulnerabilities, cyber attack, et cetera. Good? Thank you very much.